There is a grave somewhere on this earth that no human being has ever found. No pilgrim has ever knelt before it. No archaeologist has ever mapped it. No tradition, oral or written, has ever preserved its precise location with enough certainty to guide even the most determined seeker. It belongs to the greatest prophet who ever lived, the man who spoke to God face to face, as a man speaks to his friend, as it is written in Exodus 33:11. And yet, God himself made sure that no one would ever find it. The question that has haunted rabbis, church fathers, theologians, and ordinary believers for thousands of years is deceptively simple. Why? Why would the Almighty go to such lengths to conceal the resting place of his most faithful servant? Why does Deuteronomy 34:6 tell us that God buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Bethpeor? But no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. And why does the enigmatic and often overlooked verse in the Epistle of Jude, Jude 9, speak of the archangel Michael himself contending with the devil over the very body of Moses? What is God protecting? What is he preventing? And what is he, in the mystery of this concealment, teaching every generation that dares to ask the question? To begin to understand this, we must step back into the world of Moses, into the ancient Near East of the second millennium before the Common Era, into a civilization where the tombs of the great were not merely burial sites, but centers of political power, religious devotion, and, in the case of Egypt, where Moses was raised, the beating heart of an entire theology of death and immortality. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, as Acts 7:22 confirms. He knew, perhaps better than any other Israelite of his generation, what a tomb meant in that world. He had seen the pyramids. He had walked through the funerary temples dedicated to god-kings, whose bones were still being venerated centuries after their death. He had witnessed an entire civilization built around the cult of the dead, where the mummified body of a ruler became an object of worship, a locus of divine power, a thing to which prayers were addressed and before which sacrifices were offered. Egypt was the most sophisticated death cult the ancient world had ever produced, and Moses had been shaped, even if in resistance, by everything that culture held sacred. When God told Moses that he would die on Mount Nebo and not enter the Promised Land, a decree we read in Deuteronomy 32:48-52, given because Moses had not honored God as holy at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, as recorded in Numbers 20:10-12, when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, Moses did not despair. He climbed the mountain with the obedience that had characterized his entire life. He surveyed the land from the heights of Pisgah, the hills of the plains of Moab, the Jordan Valley, the shimmering line of Canaan in the distance. He saw what had been promised, and then he died, alone with God, with the land laid out before him, like an answered prayer he would receive in a different way than he had expected. But what happened next was not ordinary burial. No mourners prepared his body with oil and spices. No sons of Israel wrapped him in burial linen. No tomb was hewn from rock. The text of Deuteronomy 34:6 says simply and staggeringly that God buried him. The Hebrew allows for this reading, and the rabbinical tradition overwhelmingly preferred it. God buried Moses. The creator of the universe personally attended to the interment of his servant. And then he sealed that location with a divine silence so total that it has never been broken in all the centuries since. The cultural context here is not merely interesting, it is theologically essential, because if the location of Moses' tomb had been known to the Israelites who followed Joshua into Canaan, the temptation would have been overwhelming and, given Israel's track record, almost certainly fatal to their spiritual integrity. The people of Israel had already demonstrated repeatedly and devastatingly their tendency to syncretize the worship of Yahweh with the religious practices of surrounding nations. They had worshipped the golden calf at the very foot of Sinai, while Moses was still receiving the law on the mountain, as told in Exodus 32, 1-6. They would later worship Baal of Peor in the very region where Moses was buried, in the plains of Moab, as described in Numbers 25, a sin so severe it resulted in a plague that killed 24,000 people. The Book of Judges is essentially a long, tragic, cyclic record of a people who could not stop turning sacred things into idols. A known tomb of Moses, the man who had parted the Red Sea, who had spoken with God from within the fire and the cloud, who had brought down the very law of heaven on tablets of stone, would have become, in a matter of generations, the center of a cult of the dead that would have rivaled anything Egypt had ever produced. It would have been the most magnificent idol Israel never built, precisely because it would never have been called an idol at all. It would have been called devotion. It would have been called heritage, and it would have been spiritual destruction. God, who knows the end from the beginning, as he declares in Isaiah 46:10, prevented this catastrophe before it could begin, not by removing the memory of Moses, who is celebrated throughout Scripture as the greatest prophet Israel ever knew, but by removing the physical anchor around which a corrupted memory could have coalesced. But the story does not end there, because Jude 9 pulls back a curtain that most readers of the Bible pass by without fully registering what they are seeing. In the space of a single verse, the Apostle Jude references a cosmic confrontation. Yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, "The Lord rebuke thee." This is an extraordinary statement. Jude is drawing on a tradition. Most scholars connect it to a Jewish apocryphal text known as the Assumption of Moses, though the complete text as it once existed is no longer available to us, in which Satan himself came to lay claim to the body of Moses. The archangel Michael, the great prince who stands guard over God's people, as described in Daniel 12:1, was dispatched to attend to the burial. And the adversary opposed him, raising an accusation against Moses, possibly the act of killing the Egyptian as recorded in Exodus 2:12, to argue that Moses had blood on his hands, and therefore that the body belonged to the accuser. Think carefully about what this reveals. The devil was not interested in Moses' body for sentimental reasons. Satan is never interested in anything except the advancement of his own dark kingdom and the corruption of God's redemptive purposes. If the enemy wanted the body of Moses, it was because a known, accessible tomb of Moses would have served as an instrument of deception and idolatry on a catastrophic scale. A grave that could be visited, whose occupant could be invoked, would have been a weapon of spiritual destruction in the hands of the one Jesus described in John 8:44 as a murderer from the beginning and the father of lies. But Michael did not engage Satan in a shouting match. He did not rely on his own authority or his own righteous indignation. He appealed to the only authority that is truly final: "The Lord rebuke thee." And God's answer to the enemy's claim on Moses was the same answer he gives to every satanic challenge against those who belong to him. "Not today, not ever. This one is mine." There is a profound and practical theological lesson embedded in this exchange that every believer needs to hear clearly. Michael did not win by being superior in argument. He won by appealing to the authority of God over the situation. The rebuke of the Lord is the only truly sufficient answer to the accusations of the adversary. This is the same principle at work in Zechariah 3:1-2, where the angel of the Lord rebukes Satan for his accusations against the high priest Joshua, who stood before the divine throne clothed in filthy garments that represented the sins of the people. The enemy accuses. He always accuses. As Revelation 12:10 identifies him, he is the accuser of the brothers, who accuses them before God day and night. But the rebuke of the Lord silences every accusation, not because the accused is sinless, but because the one who justifies is God, as Paul asks rhetorically in Romans 8:33-34. Moses had indeed sinned at Meribah, but Moses had died as God's servant, and God was not going to allow his remains to become a trophy in the enemy's hands or an idol in his people's hands. Now we must ask a different but equally important question. What was God teaching the Israelites about succession and about the nature of his redemptive purposes by hiding Moses and then, with remarkable swiftness, raising up Joshua? The transition is remarkable in its intentionality. In Deuteronomy 34, Moses dies and the people mourn for 30 days. In Joshua 1, God speaks to Joshua, and the first thing he says, before any military strategy, before any territorial promise, is, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan," to Joshua 1:2. God does not allow Israel to linger at the grave of Moses, literally or spiritually. There is no extended official mourning beyond the 30 days prescribed in Deuteronomy 34:8. There is no pilgrimage route established to the tomb on Mount Nebo. There is no reliquary tradition created around Moses' staff, his sandals, or his garments. Everything that God does in the aftermath of Moses' death is designed to keep Israel's eyes forward, fixed on the task and on the living God who goes before them, and not on the memory of a dead prophet, however great. This is the same theological instinct at work in the New Testament's treatment of Jesus' resurrection. The tomb is empty, the grave clothes are folded and laid aside. The angel does not say, "Come, see where he lies, and build a shrine." The angel says, as recorded in Matthew 28:6, "He is not here, for he is risen, as he said." The living faith that Christ came to establish was never meant to be geographically anchored to a burial site or physically attached to a relic. The tragedy of so much religious history is the degree to which human beings have tried to make faith manageable by reducing it to the tangible. A bone, a stone, a tomb. When God's design has always been to draw his people toward what Hebrews 11:1 calls the evidence of things not seen, toward the living person who cannot be contained by any grave. Moses himself understood this before he died. The magnificent speeches of Deuteronomy, farewell sermons delivered by Moses to the generation about to enter Canaan, are saturated with a single urgent concern. When you get into the land, do not forget the Lord your God. When prosperity comes and cities you did not build are yours, as described in Deuteronomy 6:10-12, then be especially careful. Because the greatest spiritual danger facing Israel was not military opposition, it was memorial failure. And so God, in his sovereign and far-seeing wisdom, removed the one figure around whom a false memory cult could most easily have been built. We must also reckon with what Moses represents typologically, because the New Testament does not allow us to read the Old Testament in isolation from its Christological trajectory. Moses is, in ways that Hebrews makes explicit, a type and forerunner of Jesus the Messiah. Hebrews 3:1-6 draws the contrast precisely. Moses was faithful as a servant in God's house, but Christ is faithful as a son over God's house. Moses delivered Israel from physical slavery. Christ delivers his people from the slavery of sin and death. Moses gave the law on Sinai amid thunder and fire, as described in Exodus 19:16-19. Christ fulfills the law in his own person and writes it on human hearts by the Spirit, as promised in Jeremiah 31:33 and expounded in Hebrews 8:10. Moses' face shone with a reflected glory that was fading, as Paul explains in 2 Corinthians 3:7-18. But the glory of Christ is not reflected and not fading. It is the uncreated light of John 8:12 and the illumination of the New Jerusalem itself in Revelation 21:23. If the tomb of Moses had become a center of religious devotion, there was a real risk that Moses would have become, in Israel's religious imagination, a rival to the greater Moses who was coming. God concealed Moses in death so that Moses' legacy could remain an arrow pointing forward toward the one of whom Moses himself wrote, as Jesus stated plainly in John 5:46, "For had ye believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me." And then there is the extraordinary epilogue to Moses' story that the Gospel accounts give us. In Mark 9:28 and its parallels, on the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses appears in living glory alongside Elijah. He has not been forgotten or diminished. He stands there, radiant, speaking with Jesus. Luke 9:31 gives us the subject of their conversation. They spoke of his departure. The Greek word is precisely and deliberately exodos, the exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Moses, the man who led the first great exodus from physical bondage, now speaks with the one who is about to accomplish the final and ultimate exodus, the liberation of all humanity from the power of sin and death through his own body broken and bloodshed, and resurrection on the third day. The body that Satan had wanted to claim, the tomb whose location no man has ever found, the servant who died on the mountain with the promised land before him. He stood in the fullness of that promise, glorified and whole, a witness and a worshipper, at the summit meeting of all human history. Moses died having seen the goal, but not having reached it in the way he had anticipated. He had spent 40 years leading a people who complained and rebelled and longed for Egypt, sustained by bread from heaven as recorded in Exodus 16, by water from the rock as told in Numbers 20, by the pillar of cloud and fire as described in Exodus 13:21-22. Moses carried the weight of that people with a faithfulness almost incomprehensible, interceding for them when God threatened to destroy them after the golden calf in Exodus 32:11-14, interceding again after the report of the 12 spies in Numbers 14:13-19, crying out once that if Israel was to be destroyed, God should blot Moses himself out of the divine book first, as recorded in Exodus 32:32, one of the most staggering acts of intercessory identification in all of Scripture. And yet, after all of that, one moment of unguarded frustration at Meribah, one act of striking the rock in anger, instead of speaking to it as God had commanded in Numbers 28, sealed his exclusion from the land. The rabbinical tradition has puzzled over the proportionality of this for centuries. What the episode teaches, at its theological core, is that leaders are held to a higher standard of faithfulness, not because God is punitive, but because leaders shape the spiritual imagination of those who follow them. When Moses struck the rock and said, "Must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Numbers 20:10, he obscured the nature of God's provision and made the miracle about his own power rather than about divine grace. And in so doing, he introduced a distortion into the people's understanding of who exactly was sustaining them. This is why, even in his exclusion from Canaan, Moses remained a teacher. His exclusion taught Israel that access to God's promises is not secured by human greatness, however extraordinary. It is secured by grace alone. No man, however anointed, however intimate with the divine, stands before God on the basis of his own performance. The exclusion of Moses from Canaan is, in miniature, the entire message of Galatians. The law cannot bring you in. The law was given through Moses, and the law is glorious and holy and good, as Paul says in Romans 7:12. But the law cannot carry you across the Jordan. Grace alone carries you across, and grace has a name, Joshua, Yeshua in Hebrew, the very name of Jesus, meaning God saves. It was not Moses who led Israel into the land. It was Joshua. It was Yeshua. The author of Hebrews did not miss this. In Hebrews 4:8, he refers to Joshua leading the people into rest, noting that if Joshua had given the full and final rest, God would not have spoken of another day of rest still to come. The rest Joshua gave was real, but partial. The rest Jesus gives is complete and eternal. The concealment of Moses' body is not only protection and pedagogy and mercy, it is also prophecy. It speaks, without a single word, of the transition from the age of the law to the age of grace, from the servant to the son, from the mediator who could not fully enter the promise to the mediator who is himself the promise in person. The hidden tomb of Moses is a theological statement in stone and silence. This chapter has served its purpose. Now step forward, look up, and follow the one who comes after him, before whom both Moses and Elijah stood on the mountain in reverent witness, and about whom the voice of the Father said what he had been building toward through the entire vast narrative of the Old Testament. This is my beloved Son, hear him. Mark 9:7. Moses is not lost. Moses is not forgotten. He stood on the Mount of Transfiguration in the company of the Son of God and spoke of the Exodus that would set all people free. His tomb is hidden, but his witness is radiant, and the God who hid him in death revealed him in glory, which is, when you stop to think about it, the same thing God promises every one of his children who trusts in the name that is above every name, the name before which every knee shall bow, as Paul declares in Philippians 2:10, the name in which both Moses and all who follow Moses' greater successor shall stand on the last day, unashamed and unafraid. If this reflection stirred something within you today, if something in the story of Moses, the hidden grave, the archangel's confrontation with the enemy, or the radiance of the transfiguration brought new clarity or new wonder, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear that God's purposes cannot be derailed by death, that his servants cannot be stolen, and that the greatest prophet who ever lived pointed with his whole life and with his very concealed burial toward the one who is alive forevermore. And leave us a comment telling us where in the world you are reading or listening from today. There is something deeply moving about the global family of faith, gathering around a single word of God, from every nation, every tribe, every tongue, every corner of the earth, all looking at the same empty tomb and finding in it the same unshakable hope. We would love to know where you are. There is yet another dimension to this mystery that opens up when we consider the entire arc of Moses' life, not merely its ending. Moses was a man who had known radical displacement from his earliest days. Born in danger, placed in a basket of reeds on the Nile by a mother who trusted God with what she could not protect, adopted into the very household of the enemy, raised with privilege while his people groaned under slavery. He was a man who never fully belonged anywhere in his first 40 years, not among the Hebrews, whom he tried to defend, but who rejected him, as recorded in Exodus 2:14, and not among the Egyptians, whose oppression he could not stomach. He fled to Midian, tended Jethro's flocks for another 40 years, married and had children, and must at some point have wondered whether the burning bush would ever come, whether God had forgotten the people he had promised to remember, whether the covenant made with Abraham in Genesis 15 and renewed with Isaac and Jacob had somehow stalled in the grinding machinery of history. And then the burning bush came, and in that fire that consumed without destroying, itself a picture of the God who dwells in unapproachable light, as 1 Timothy 6:16 declares, a God whose holiness would burn through every human container that tried to hold him, and yet who was somehow present, speaking, calling, commissioning. Moses received the assignment that would define everything, and the God who commissioned him gave him, right there in that moment, the most important theological statement in the Hebrew Bible: I am that I am. Exodus 3:14. Not I was, not I will be. I am, the eternally present one, the one for whom past, present, and future are not sequential realities, but a single, coherent, living now. And if God is I am, then Moses' death on Mount Nebo was not the interruption of a story, but the completion of a chapter in a story that the I am had been writing from before the foundations of the world. The hidden tomb is, in this light, a statement about the nature of divine authorship. God does not lose his servants. He repositions them. He does not abandon his purposes when a chapter ends. He turns the page. The same I am, who called Moses from the fire of the burning bush, attended to his burial in the valley of Moab. And the same I am, who concealed his resting place from human eyes, revealed him on the mountain of transfiguration in heavenly glory. The arc of Moses' life is the arc of every life surrendered to God, called through fire, sustained through wilderness, brought to the end of self-sufficiency, and revealed in glory on the other side of death. As Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4:17, the momentary lightness of present affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And if this is true for ordinary believers, how much more does it illuminate the destiny of the servant who spoke with God face to face? The rabbis taught, and they were not wrong to teach it, that Moses was the greatest of all the prophets. But the greatness of Moses is precisely this, that he pointed beyond himself. His whole life was an arrow, his birth, his calling, his law, his intercession, his exclusion from Canaan, his death, his hidden burial, his appearance at the Transfiguration. Every element of his story is a signpost, and every signpost has the same inscription. Not yet, not here, not this man. Look further, go deeper. There is one coming who is greater. There is an exodus still ahead. There is a promised land that no earthly Jordan can border and no earthly Joshua can fully give. Moses knew this. Standing on Pisgah, looking at Canaan, he knew that what he saw was a shadow of something more real than itself. The land flowing with milk and honey was always a metaphor for something that earth cannot produce and geography cannot contain. The fullness of life in the presence of God, the inheritance of the saints in light, as Paul calls it in Colossians 1:12, the rest that remains for the people of God, as Hebrews 4:9 promises. The concealment of Moses' body is thus, finally, an act of theological mercy toward all of us, toward every person who has ever been tempted to stop short of the ultimate, to settle for the symbol instead of pressing on to the reality, to build a shrine where God has placed an arrow, to rest at a grave when the risen one is calling us forward. God hid Moses' body so that we would not stop at Moses. He sealed the tomb so that we would keep walking toward the open one. He silenced the location so that we would keep listening for the living voice of the one who says, to every generation that will hear him, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. John 11:25-26. That is the word Moses was always announcing in advance from a distance, with his whole extraordinary and flawed and magnificent life. That is the word that still stands over every grave, over every ending, over every moment when the chapter seems to close and the next page has not yet turned.